The Beast, the Monster of Genova, the Madman. These are all titles used to describe Luis Garavito. Some even go as far as to say that he's the most evil person to ever exist, and they have very good reason for saying so. The inhumane crimes of this one individual will leave you in utter shock and disbelief. And what's even scarier is that despite his sadistic crimes, he will soon be freed to roam amongst us again. Luis Alfredo Garavito was born on January 25, 1957 in Genova to Manuel Garavito and Rosa Delia Cubillos. He was the oldest of 6 siblings and suffered an extremely disturbing childhood. Their father was an alcoholic, an emotional and physical abuser, and an overall terrible human being. Apart from a dysfunctional family, Luis was exposed to an environment where crimes were extremely common. Colombia had been the subject of a decades-long civil war that began in the late 1960s and had left thousands of citizens homeless. Most of these citizens were children who were left with no families or protection from the dangers of a crime-stricken Colombia. And if you're not convinced about how bad the situation in Colombia was, here's another fact for you. In the 1990s, Colombia was considered the murder capital of the world, with a murder taking place every 2 days. In the midst of these bad conditions, Luis Garavito attended school. He was described as a shy young boy with an unusually bad temper. It was also rumored that he may have been beaten up in school, as this was legal in Colombia at the time. At 11 years old, Luis Garavito's father forced him to drop out of school. Eventually, Garavito ran away from his turbulent family home, barely surviving on the streets of Colombia. During this time, a man found him on the street and offered him clean clothes and food if he came to his house. But instead, the man assaulted him, leaving Garavito even more scared and traumatized. You would think that a man who was assaulted and abused as a young boy would never want someone else to go through something like that. But in the case of Luis Garavito, the truth was very different. At the age of 16, Garavito was arrested by the police for allegedly molesting a young boy, but was released from custody when he claimed that he didn't intend to commit any crimes. While Garavito did try to find a job and settle down, he spent most of the 1990s targeting and violating young boys. His sadistic nature seemed to be intensifying, and at first he didn't feel good about it. He sought medical help for depression and psychosis, and even took prescribed medicine. But in between the frequent psychiatric hospital visits, Garavito continued violating young boys and never admitted to doing so. The unrest in Colombia had made homeless children vulnerable to attacks. Luis took advantage of this when he took the life of his first victim. What I'm about to tell you is truly bone-chilling. Garavito claimed that his crime in 1992 was inspired by a demonic voice telling him to commit the heinous crime. That surely does send chills down my spine. The victim was Juan Carlos, and Garavito spotted him while drinking at a bar. Leaving the bar, Garavito started to follow the boy into the night and brought a butcher's knife along. The fate of the poor boy was devastating, with police finding his lifeless body with his front teeth knocked out and clear signs of violation. Only 6 days later, the ruthless monster struck again. This time, the victim was a poor 12-year-old boy. Garavito continued his spree of heinous crimes, taking the lives of 8 other boys just over a few months. Garavito even documented his executions in a journal and kept souvenirs of them. His crimes became so frequent that at one point he was reported to have taken the lives of several boys on the same day. But Luis Garavito was an intelligent criminal. He carried out all his crimes in a clever and planned-out way. His targets would be the homeless and poor boys that would roam the streets of Colombia, begging for food and shelter. He would lure the younger boys by offering them candy, and the older ones by some sort of employment. For this, he would impersonate a priest, a farmer, an elderly man, or a street vendor, looking for someone young to help around his house or business. Once he offered an employment opportunity, he would often walk with the child for a long time, trying to gain his trust. After a long walk, the already weak child would be extremely tired, with no energy to resist an attack. The ruthless beast would then strike. He would tie his victim's hands together and do the most horrific things before inevitably taking their lives. Even though children were disappearing in plain sight and their bodies were found in the outskirts of Colombia, the police did not notice that there was a criminal behind the executions until 5 years after Garavito took his first life in 1992. In late 1997, a mass grave was accidentally discovered by the police. The scene of the brutally treated 25 lifeless bodies was so disturbing and inhumane that the police thought it was the evil doings of a cult. Then, in February of 1998, 2 naked, lifeless bodies of children were found next to each other. A third body was also found a few feet away, as well as a weapon. While further searching the area of the crime scene, the police found something unusual: a handwritten note which contained an address. Following the address, the police ended up at a woman's house who happened to be Garavito's girlfriend. Garavito was not at home, but his things were, and his girlfriend allowed the police to go through them. Upon inspection, the police found incriminating evidence: Garavito's Journal of Executions. A search for Garavito continued for days, but he was nowhere to be found until April 22nd. A young man sitting in an alleyway noticed a boy being followed by an older man who accosted him. The young man immediately reported this incident to the authorities, and the criminal was arrested on the suspicion of attempted violation. Little did the authorities know that they had in their custody one of the most sadistic criminals in the history of mankind. The prolific criminal easily cracked under pressure when interrogated and confessed to abusing over 147 boys and burying their bodies in unmarked graves. He even told the police the exact locations of where he buried the bodies by drawing out a map. Luis Garavito was convicted on 138 counts of execution. The maximum penalty for taking someone's life in Colombia is 13 years, and multiplied with the 138 counts, Garavito was set to spend 1,853 years in jail. That would mean life in prison for the monster of Colombia. But the astonishing part is that the authorities reduced the sentence from 1,853 years to only 22. And why, you may ask? Because Garavito had helped the police find the victims' bodies. It's surprising to think that the police cut his sentence by 1,831 years just because he pointed out the grave sites of his victims. What's even more unsettling is the fact that Luis Garavito, one of the most prolific criminals in history, is currently up for parole in 2023. In 2020, Garavito was put on medical discharge after being diagnosed with leukemia. As one might imagine, the possibility of Garavito's parole doesn't sit well with many people in Colombia, as releasing him would mean releasing a monster back into the wild. What are your thoughts on knowing that this heinous person's release is just around the corner?